which is awesome.
Mhm.
Welcome, welcome everyone.
I don't know if we're gonna get all 31 people attending, but maybe if people wanted to introduce themselves, I don't know if you want to go around, but everyone's welcome to do it in the chat. It's always interesting to see where people are coming from.
Yeah. Yeah, so in the chat, if you want to just indicate where you're joining us from, that would be awesome. Because we're going to get going. We want to be able to give Albert as much time to share as possible. So my name is Eva Wilson Fontaine. I'm the team lead at Anish Corporation. And I just want to welcome everyone. At first, I just want to say that due to the weather, I might be spotty in this introduction, but bear with us because I am out in the country. But I just want to welcome everyone. With COVID, we've had to adapt to how we're sharing information, and majority, 99% of our programming right now is done on the land here at Cedar Lake Ranch. But with COVID hitting, we've had to adapt and change how we share the teachings and the information. And so we've been doing it through Zoom. And the benefit of Zoom is that people can join us from anywhere in the world, actually. So that's the beauty of Zoom. And Albert comes from, I'm just going to introduce Albert for those of you who don't know him. Albert is a status Indian with ancestry from, Albert, can you say the name of the band?
The Sichawea Sikh.
Cree Nation and the Métis community of Norway House in northern Manitoba. He has over 30 years of experience as a human rights activist and is one of the directors of the 2Spirited people in Manitoba. Albert began his 2Spirit advocacy in Winnipeg in 1986 and became an HIV and AIDS activist in 1987. He was the director of the Manitoba Aboriginal AIDS Task Force from 1991 to 2001. In 2018, Albert received an honorary doctorate of laws from the University of Winnipeg. Wow. Albert lives in Winnipeg, where he works as a consultant specializing in Indigenous peoples, cultural reclaim, and cross-cultural training. He also has a website if you want to visit it. It's at www.albertmcleod.ca. So today, the session is on 2Spirit's Resurgence in the 20th century. And so this session will describe the journey of Indigenous LGBTQ people of the early days of colonization to present. And the 32 2SLGBTQIA calls to justice identified in the National Inquiry into the murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. Final report will also be discussed here today. So with that, we are going to be, Albert will call for a break. So we'll take a health break and then we'll all come back. So you won't have to actually leave the Zoom. You can just step away and take off your video if you want. But we will be having a time for questions and answers at the end of the Zoom. So about 30 minutes and once Albert will call around 3 o'clock, we'll be doing that. But I also want to introduce Amanda Ferlin, if you just want to give a wave, Amanda. For those of you can see her, she's going to be our moderator today. She's our Zoom expert here at Anish. So we're really grateful to have her. So she'll be fielding the questions to Albert, and you can put your questions in the Zoom or during that time, you can also maybe unmute your mic. At the end of every Zoom and any workshop that we have or session, we always look for your feedback on how we can do things better. And so we'd love to hear from you. So we send it out by a monkey survey, right, Amanda?
Yeah, via Survey Monkey, it's called.
Yeah. And so it'll go right directly into your email, and we'll ask you to complete that and then send it back to Amanda at the email address of admin@anish.ca. So with that, I want to welcome, a warm welcome to our guest, Albert McLeod.
Great, thank you, Eva and Amanda. I'm just going to go into my PowerPoint here. And is it shared now? Can you see it? Can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. So Amanda will help guide me through this and help us with any technical stuff. Again, this session is titled 2Spirit Resurgence in the 21st Century. And it is principally about Indigenous people who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning, or asexual. And I can do some later clarification around those terms as we move forward. The logo you see is the new logo for the Two-Spirited people of Manitoba. And it represents our indigeneity through the image of an eagle, but also the pride flag in that it has the various colors and meanings behind the pride flag. And the pride flag is just an identifier, and usually it is across North America a time when people will do a pride march to celebrate their identity, a festival, there'll be entertainment, there'll be food. It really is a time for the whole community to gather and just celebrate the expression of gender identity as well as sexual diversity. And so this is the merging of two points of view, the Indigenous point of view through the eagle, and then the more modern understanding of LGBTQ identity and liberation. So what is a two-spirit person? The term is relatively new. It's 30 years old this year. So for some people, might not be so new. So in terms of colonization, we have to realize that Indigenous people lived in North America tens of thousands of years before colonization. So what happened was a culture evolved, language evolved, science, technology evolved, belief system evolved, right? And so modern terms like, gay, lesbian, transgender, only evolved in the last, in North America, probably since the 60s, where they have been commonly used in the mainstream community around gay liberation, like the 50s and the 60s. So, homosexual was, I think, coined in the late 1880s, transgender 200 years later in 1988. Lesbian is an old Roman word that goes back, thousands of years. And so again, for Indigenous people who have their, Indigenous languages, it really is about understanding what these terms mean and how they relate to people's gender identity or sexual orientation. So Two-Spirit is a term used to describe Indigenous people who assume cross or multiple gender roles, attributes, dress, and attitudes for personal, spiritual, cultural, ceremonial, or social reasons. These roles are defined by each culture group and can be fluid over a person's lifetime. Modern terms like gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, transsexual, and intersex, in combination with or exclusive to Two-Spirit, may be adopted by some Indigenous people to define who they are. So today, we have many Indigenous people in Canada, and some people grow up, they could be gay or lesbian or trans, and they really don't see a need to label themselves, right? And where there's others who have no problem with saying, well, I'm a gay man or I'm a two-spirit person. So in this education, it's like you can't generalize, and that people will have different choices, right? And I know there's a lot of, especially in First Nations or Métis communities, there are people who are gay and lesbian, and they don't say, they don't talk about it, they don't disclose, it's just understood that they are. So in a city, it might be very different, where people are more likely to talk about that as part of their identity. An example of the change that's happened, and I call this resurgence, is there has been a long period of really erasure or silence around LGBT people in North America and other parts of the world where there was colonization. And now we're coming out of that period where a lot of things were very controlled by government, by institutions, whether it was the legal institution, the health institution, the education institutions that really controlled how society thought about males and females and sexuality in general. And so now we're coming out and really learning about the diversity of the human experience and creating opportunities for everybody to have equal access. So an example of this, if we look at Caitlyn Jenner, who is not Indigenous, but really is an example of this resurgence of the trans identity in this case. And Caitlyn, early on in their life, was very successful in the 1986 Olympics and became recognized worldwide for the decathlon, which is 8 different sport activities, and won, so, as the Olympic champion, Caitlyn, was extolled as, this ideal masculine person, a winner, physically able, this sort of white European male. But later in life, Caitlyn's identity began to change, like in the last 10 years, in that Caitlyn came out as a trans female person. And so, if you've watched the Kardashians on TV, you kind of learned about the whole family. And that, Caitlyn transitioned, to being fully female. And so that's an example of resurgence in that early on in Caitlyn's life, they had a particular gender identity, social identity, sexual orientation. And then through, growing older, maturing, and moving towards an authentic identity, came out as a transgender person, a trans female, and now lives as a woman in our society. So that's kind of an example of, how people can transition. So that's where I'm from. I'm from the PAW, and my ancestry originates from Nelson House, or Nisitawayasik Cree Nation, as well as the Métis communities of Cross Lake and Norway House. And that's where I grew up until I was the age of 19. And in those days, like the 60s and 70s, we just didn't have the level of awareness we have today about diversity. And that we were more or less, if you were gay or lesbian, you were more or less ostracized or targeted for, shaming or bullying because you weren't sort of representing as, heterosexual or the ideal male and female, especially in high school or junior high. There was a lot of pressure to conform to these ideas about what was socially acceptable. Growing up in the North, as I mentioned, my ancestry is, from Cross Lake and Norway House. And during the Hudson Bay era, the times, a lot of the Scottish men from married Indigenous women from the North. And that happened in my family. My grandfather was a first generation Scots born here as part of the fur trade. And then he married into a Cree family from Nelson House that were working in the fur trade. And so that, in those days we were considered Métis, or half-breeds actually, as my mother would put it. And that was a terminology used back in those days, the 30s and the 40s. And that the woman on the far left is my birth grandmother. She died after her children were born, including my mother. And afterward, in the Cree culture, there's a tradition that because there was arranged marriages before colonization, and that a man could marry multiple sisters from one family. And after Christianity came here, a lot of that practice was eliminated and became taboo. But after my birth grandmother died, the family arranged for her older sister to go and live with my grandfather to help him raise his 3 children. She was born in 1897. She lived to be 93, and she passed away in 1990 in Winnipeg. But she was a great mentor of mine in terms of growing up with her. She knew her language. She never spoke English. She tanned hides. She fished. She made moccasins and beadwork, and she made pemmican. She had all these skills. She smoked fish. She smoked moose meat, all of those traditional skills. And the bottom picture, it includes me. That was in Waboten about 1966. And I'm on the far left there. And as a little boy, was very intrigued about the feminine world, right? The female world and beauty and those kind of things. And you can see that expression because I have a headband on and I'm wearing that necklace around my neck. So really, and those are my girl cousins, right? So for 2Spirit boys, we usually hang out with our aunts or our girl cousins, right? Because that's who we are aligned to, right? That's who we have things in common with, this sense of femininity. A girl who is, either a trans male or or a lesbian woman, she might be aligned with masculinity. So she might hang out with her boy cousins or, their uncles, right? So that, and the thing about this is that this was understood in the Cree and the Ojibwe culture that, there would be children who were unique in that way, that they, a boy might have feminine interests and a girl might have masculine interests, right? And so in that era was really a time of assimilation into Western ways of being. People were going to residential school still, Indigenous children were being sent to regular schools in towns or cities. And so we were really being assimilated into being Western or white. And anything about our identity or culture really didn't have any value. And so similar, like in that period with this, Cree understanding of my role as a little 2Spirit boy, and that my behavior was considered normal or natural. And with my grandmother, with her depth of knowledge about her language, her history, her traditions, that we were really relics of that time, right? That, it was something to be discarded. These beliefs and this knowledge was really in the 60s and 70s, a time to be discarded. And so that's what happened, right? Is my grandmother's knowledge was not valued by the people around her. She was, thought of something old-fashioned or really quaint. And then my role as a 2Spirit youth was also something that was ignored or really forgotten. And by the time I was in high school, I began to be shamed and bullied by my peers, the other students, because they didn't have this teaching, they didn't have this knowledge. The pressure was to get me to conform to their way of life, their worldview. And I resisted it. And I quit school, I think when I was in grade 10, because I didn't find they were being very authentic people, right? And I didn't want to compromise my values. So I quit high school at that time. So that was growing up in the North. And the other piece that I want to talk about in this is about the significance of my grandmother's smokehouse. And there it is in the back. It's that rectangular frame. Usually it would be in the shape of a teepee with canvas wrapped around it or blankets wrapped around it. And that's how fish could be smoked on racks, or moose meat could be smoked on racks. And this is the one my grandfather built. It's a fancy one for my grandmother. And I was familiar with it, like I saw it. It was part of my world. In the back of there, you see a fancy dog house. So dogs had it really good back in those days as well. And there I'm sitting with my cousin. So in terms of culture and identity, that was the last smokehouse in my family. And that was in 1966. So that's 54 years ago. And so when we talk about identity as Indigenous people, sometimes we don't realize what we've discarded, what we've dropped along the way, how valuable these things are, right? And so to me, I really think about the children who grow up in the city of Winnipeg. There's 94,000 Indigenous people in Winnipeg. And how many of those children get to experience their grandmother or their mother's smokehouse, right? And so we begin to understand these dynamics of loss and trauma and anxiety, right? So to me, that was a part of my world. The smokehouse was a natural part of my world. And, I know with my relatives' children, they don't know what it is, right? It's lost in the story of our family. So I work with Roger Roulette, who's an Ojibwe language specialist here, and doing cultural reclamation work. We have to be very careful because some of the stuff we receive from other parts of North America that are not particular to this part of the world. Some of it could be pan-Indigenous, where it's taken from one part of Canada, introduced here, where it wasn't traditional, right? And then there's diversity among the First Nation beliefs with the Métis and the Inuit as well. So one size does not fit all. So in this case, in the work I do, I approach experts like Roger Roulette, who's very expert in the Ojibwe language, the Ojibwe worldview, and the Ojibwe life philosophy. So it really is using the language as a tool for authentication of cultural knowledge and teachings, because they go back tens of thousands of years, right? And so they've lasted this long. There's a reason why these words and actions and terms are used to manage life. Now, when Roger talks about when the baby's born, the human relationship with the natural world is the difference between what we call animate life or the animate being, beings that can move on their own, like a deer or a moose, right? They have their own motion, their own energy. Similarly, with humans, we also are animate beings. We can move through the landscape through our own energy. There's other beings that can't. Plants are stuck, rocks can't walk, trees can't walk, right? So there's a differentiation. Now, in terms of the baby that's born, the human baby, it's understood to be this energy, right? This animate being that is not just defined by its biological sex or gender, right? So the Ojibwe didn't do that. They didn't have pronouns he and she, right? They knew that, creation involved a man and a woman, but that wasn't the most important part. The most important is that when the baby was born, it was a life force unto its own. And that only later they could, if they wished, this baby would, fit with a gender, right? Fit with a sexual orientation. But when it was born, the family and the community didn't know, right? So how it was described, when the baby comes, it's he/she, which means animate being is who he/she is supposed to be, right? So for me, growing up in the North, my Cree family, because they were fluent in the Cree language, they understood this, right? That me as a little boy who was feminine was my path, right? And they were not to interfere with it, right? Because I was supposed to be who I was supposed to be, right? And, you know, in some families, it's still, that knowledge is still there and it's still practiced. As well as our use of pronouns today, you know, we've been colonized and, you know, learned, you know, there's a particular identity for women and a particular identity for men. So we use these pronouns, he and she. And so Roger says in Algonquin languages such as Cree and Ojibwe, pronouns have no gender as in he or she as they do in other languages such as English. Instead, they have proximates, which are understood to be either he/she or something alive. So really, that's kind of the foundation of our, you know, individual and collective rights, that as animate beings or living entities, we belong, right? Regardless of what society thinks or, you know, settler society thinks, from the Indigenous point of view, is that we are meant to be. And, you know, you could be straight or heterosexual, you could be trans, you can be gay, you know, that's a part of your identity. But the principal part is you have all of these rights because you are meant to exist. So this imperative is very important, especially around parenting and raising children. So the Indigenous cultural imperative: every child has a purpose, a role, a destiny, and possesses a divine gift. This philosophy applies to LGBTQI 2Spirit people who also come from the spiritual world. To negatively interfere with the life journey of 2Spirit people is a social and cultural taboo among Indigenous peoples around the world. How am I doing? You guys still there? Hello?
Yeah, we're still here and listening. You're doing a
That's
great
good.
job.
Still here.
Thank you. And all I see is the screen, so I don't see any people. Okay, so in regards to this gift, and this is really that sort of misunderstanding between Western society and Christianity and the Indigenous spiritual system and life philosophy, right? And that for Indigenous people, the spirituality is about communicating with other parts of the natural world and the unseen world, right? We call it the spirit world. And Roger says those spirits are not like us, like they're not human. They're not versions of human, right? They're amorphous. He says that means they don't have a shape, right? So when we think about thunder, that's a spirit, right? And when the thunder comes, the rain comes, the lightning comes, and the wind comes. And for the Ojibwe, they believe it's a time of cleansing, right? The spirits are putting things back where they were, right? So that's why they're so important. Now, because we can't see them, Roger says that the people decided they're going to choose an image to reflect the thunders, the thunder beings. And so they chose a bird, right? Because we recognize birds every day. This one was special though. It was called the Thunderbird, right? So it's how we can recognize that spirit of the thunder and the rain, that force, right? Because you can't put lightning in a bottle. You can't keep wind in a bottle, right? So you can't contain it. And that's the difference with Christianity. A lot of Christianity uses the human image to describe the supreme being, right? Like God and Jesus. And that's the difference between Indigenous and non-Indigenous views of spirituality. And, you know, after colonization happened, there was a church in every reserve, every Métis community, every Inuit hamlet. And so that was really, the control was really about minimizing the Indigenous belief that I just shared with you and imposing the Euro-Christian one that as being the only one. Right. And so that's why we're researching. We're coming out of that period and recognizing the power of our own spiritual belief system. There's in the Ojibwe language, there's a word that describes that relationship. It's called Miniguisi Win. It means given or received from the divine. And that's an ability that everyone has, right? We have the ability to offer tobacco, offer our cloth, and then petition the natural or the spiritual world for something we need. Because the spirits know our physical life is short, it's more than likely they will assist us, right? And so this is a gift that we all have, that we, when someone is ill, especially now, with COVID, I see on Facebook, people are asking for prayers for their family member, right? And so when everybody prays, it's that, we pray to the spirit world that this person, their life can be extended, right? Their life can be saved. So the connection that we do have with is usually through our different ceremonies, could be the pipe ceremony, sweat lodge, or the sun dance. And they're very complex, very sophisticated ways of making this contact. And so some of you on this event today probably have participated in the sweat lodge. And again, it's how we make that relationship with the spiritual world and do our offerings. The other part about child rearing and creating a sort of a social environment is the work of Dr. Claire Brandt. He was Mohawk, and he did some work with children who were in mental health care. And a lot of times he saw that they were being misdiagnosed because of their behavior. And part of it was because the Western healthcare professionals didn't understand Indigenous child rearing methods that were more complex than Western ones. So he described some of them in this paper in 1990. Conflict suppression, again, non-interference, non-competitiveness, emotional restraint, sharing, the concept of time, protocols, and humiliating superego. And his understanding of the superego was that for Indigenous children, between the ages of when they were born to the time they were 6, they were doted on, they were spoiled. And it was to create this big ego in them, this big resilience part of their, their confidence, their emotional, mental strength, in that they could survive any kind of adversity later on in their life. Like they wouldn't give up, right? That they were very strong mentally and emotionally. But because they had to be socialized into their peer group, probably, by the time they were 11 or 12, and there was new babies following them, that they could no longer be the center of attention, they couldn't be spoiled, they couldn't be doted on. So their peers would, tease them and joke with them. And that was a way to deflate that big ego so they would know how to manage, relationships amongst their peer group, and then move into adulthood and then fit into the social dynamics of their community. For example, today, if you see babies in chickenoggins, it's really fancy, very embroidered and decorated, and they're wearing this big bonnet with, embroidery and fancy work on it. And that's that period of creating the superego for the baby. And then maybe 5 years later, you see that same kid, and they're got, t-shirt on, snotty nose. They're not the favorite anymore, right? And this was really a practice of how children were socialized to function within the family and in the broader community. Now, gender diversity is common around the world, and colonization has changed it for most Indigenous peoples around the world because they were colonized by people from Europe, from Spain, from Russia, from Holland, from France, and then, the English. So kind of that period, from the 1500s onwards. So it's a period of 500 years where a lot of these Indigenous ideas about gender diversity were impacted by colonization. So in this map, you can really see the extent of how common it was actually before colonization. Now, how in North America, part of the aspect of colonization is that the first people that arrived here in North America were men from Europe. They were explorers, they were soldiers. They were sent here actually by the kings and the queens of their territory because those kingdoms were actually fighting about religion, right? Um, Fighting with each other, and they were very violent wars. They had over centuries with each other, and they needed gold, they needed silver to keep paying their armies. So they sent these ships out around the world into these new territories, principally to find this gold and the silver to pay their armies. And so the men that actually arrived in indigenous territories were soldiers, they were businessmen. Sometimes they would bring clergy, a priest, with them, and they had a sort of a technique of colonizing the people, and was introducing the belief system, the Christian belief system, that men were superior to women, white men were superior to men of color, and that the Christian, teachings were the only ones that should exist in the world. So these 5 images really show that period of colonization where men were placed on the pedestal or the hierarchy of control of indigenous lands. And you see the painting here from Europe where God is actually portrayed as human, and that God is the old man giving the gift of life to Adam, which is not biologically correct because Adam couldn't have a baby. And then you see the introduction of the concept of sinning through the introduction of hell, and damnation, and the devil. And here you see Jesus is arm wrestling with the devil. So this concept of a mortal sinning, and that if you failed as a human, you could go to hell. In the bottom left there is from Hollywood in the 60s. It's the 10 Commandments, a very popular movie that's even still seen today. You might see this movie at Christmas time or at Easter. And it really regurgitates this idea about, white European superiority and control of all things in society. And so it's Charlton Heston playing Moses and then the 10 Commandments. Again, the churches were part of colonization. They were part of these royal kingdoms in Europe at the time, and they were very influential. And this is the Pope just after colonization, when Christopher Columbus bumped into in South America. And initially, the church was okay for the indigenous people to practice their spirituality. But once the gold and the emeralds and the furs and the silver began to come, they changed their mind and really got involved in terms of obliterating or erasing indigenous languages, identity, and spirituality, and to impose the Euro-Christian belief onto indigenous peoples. And this guy on the right, we recognize as, during Christmas time. And we live in a capitalist society, so it's very interesting that once a year, this man comes and gives away free gifts to everybody, right? So I kind of call him the car salesman of colonization, where we're imprinted with these images, right? In this case, this is 5 images of European men and how they're prominent in our culture, in our media, and how our children are exposed to them, right? In school, in university, and through media, right? And so it really imprints us how colonization functions and who has the power. So anybody who's on this call, what is common to all of these images? There's one thing that's common to these 5 images. That's like a trigger that speaks to colonization. Anybody want to take a venture, a guess?
I think the first thing that I notice is that they're all white.
Yeah, it's more than that. There's one particular part of each image that is meant to send us a message, a subliminal message about authority.
Somebody commented their beards.
Yep, their beards, their white beard. And so historically, the elder statesmen, right, the wise men, that the concentration of power in a lot of these colonial societies was around these elder statesmen, right? They were judges, they were teachers, they were priests, and this is really how the society functioned, right? So each image has the beard, and four of them actually have the white beard, right? So it's a message to us, where's the center of power in our society? When we are struggling, where do we go to for help or resources? Who makes the ultimate decision, right? It's the one with the white beard. Again, this is propaganda, right? It's colonial propaganda to inform us of the unwritten rules of how our society functions and how we have to follow those rules. Because if we don't, something bad is going to happen if we don't follow those rules. Now, what does this picture say to you?
He has a beard and it's turning white.
Becoming white.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, you know, whether it's intentional or not, you know, for our prime minister to now have a beard that's turning white, you know, it may not be conscious, but again, it's how structure is developed, right? How its structure is built. The political structure in our country is built, right? It may just be a coincidence. But again, you know, as we're dealing with politics and now we're dealing with COVID, he grew a beard, right? The other part of the whole process of colonization that affected Two-Spirit people was through the residential school period, as well as the day school. And this is called the Lacombe's Ladder. And it was a 6-foot long graphic poster that was used to inform, especially Indigenous children, but also adults about Christianity. And this is the top part that really shows what the message was, right? And on the right, you see the path of Indigenous people. You see a dragon, it's very dark, and you see serpents. And then you see this fire, you see a snake, and it's literally called hell, right? And then you see the Indigenous people on their path of their culture, their traditions, their ceremonies. They would end up in hell unless they were baptized or unless they converted to Christianity. At the very bottom there, you will see a priest leading a family of Indigenous people. And in those days, they would have been called pagans or heathens, right? That they practiced the old tradition of Indigenous knowledge. And here, this priest is leading them to salvation. And it's about converting to Christianity and they would be saved. And so they're on this path. And then along the way, there's Jesus, and then there's the fire of cleansing there. And ultimately, they will be, you know, go to heaven if they convert, right? Now, again, this was a tool used for children, very young children, and it would be equivalent to like a comic book today for children, right? It's bright colored, there's a lot of things happening, so children would be fascinated with it. And they didn't know how to analyze what they were seeing or hearing or being told, right? But it was a way to begin to get these children to devalue their own identity, their language, what their parents told them about their belief system, their relationship to the land, right? And on the right, this is actually what was going on. They were trying to get these children to abandon their identity, and in doing so, abandon their hold on their traditional territory. So really, it was a cynical ploy by adults to try to get hold of these traditional territories to take out more resources, right? So that Indigenous people would not resist, right? And you see it today. You see it with the pipelines and the mines and the building of dams. You still see that pressure today. The other tool that was used that affected Two-Spirit people was the Indian residential schools themselves, the buildings. They were huge dormitories where boys and girls were segregated based on the church's idea of what constituted a male and a female. And here, this is from Sturgeon Guy Indian Residential School at Sturgeon Landing. And here you see the girls with the priests and the nuns who were really, they replaced these children's parents. And these girls are wearing uniforms, they're wearing tams, their hair is cut. So they will be raised in what Western society assumes to be a female, a girl, or a woman. And then the boys on the right, their hair is cut short, they're wearing uniforms. So they will all be raised and instructed to be males. Now, the problem is within both the groups, we know there was, gay men, lesbian women, and transgender people, right? And this is how colonization imposed this gender. It's called a binary gender identity on Indigenous peoples. Whereas in the past, people could express, their uniqueness. Like, you would have transgender males and females before colonization. You could have feminine boys and masculine girls, and it wasn't an issue. But as soon as this began, in probably the late 1880s, for generations this happened where the experience of Two-Spirit people was actually erased across Canada in First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities. Now, this school actually burned down in 1952. These were the 7 churches that the government collaborated with to run these schools: the Anglican Church, the Baptist Church, the Mennonite Pioneer Mission, Methodist Church, Presbyterian Church, and the Roman Catholic Church, and the United Church of Canada. Now, what happened with these students is that they knew they had been abused. So I think in the 80s, they put forward a class action lawsuit against the government of Canada. And Canada settled out of court because they could not defend what they had done to these children, right? They had imprisoned them, they had abused them, and they had tried to take these children's culture away. Do we want to take a short break? How are we doing? You holding up?
Yeah, it's very interesting. If
I'll just go
take a
after.
short-
Yeah, I'll go through this next section, then we could take a break.
Okay, sounds
Okay.
good.
So again, as I talked about pre-contact and that sort of understanding of inclusion, I developed this tool. It's a visual tool that really describes what existed before contact. So generally at the top there, we see male and female. For Indigenous people, there was an understanding that that was a part of life, right? The natural cycle of life. Now that was if you were human, if you were a plant, and also if you were an animal, right? That people and animals plants would procreate as a part of nature. And you needed that male and female energy in order for that to happen. The biological part was the sperm had to shake hands with the ovum, right? And that means people had to have sex. So plants have sex, animals have sex, and humans have sex. And in pre-contact times, that was common knowledge, right? And it wasn't something shameful. It wasn't something hidden. And it was actually taught to children that, this was a part of the natural world. And how it was described was relying on the natural world. So looking to the sky world and beginning to, it's called personification, which you choose something from nature and you make it like a human so we can relate to it better. So you make it a person, right? So we could use father, sun, and grandmother moon, right? So they become part of that story. So a lot of our legends involved either the world below or the sky above. It involves like animals like Coyote, who's a trickster, Nanabojo or Wisagajak, who are tricksters, and on the West Coast is Raven, right? And these spirits help us tell this story about our relationship to each other and the natural world. So in some cultures, the man is the keeper of the fire, so the sun would represent the man, and the moon would represent the female, water, right? So you have those two expressions of male and female energy. The orb below is what I talked about, is that animate being, right? Is for the indigenous people, we didn't define it, right? We didn't know where that spark of life came from, that mysterious energy that made something that could breathe and move and cry, right? And that's where the two-spirit people sit, right? On either side of that energy. The two-spirited male, the two-spirited female, commonly known as gay or lesbian or trans. We retain, I call it like magic, like a unicorn. That's our gift. Then the other roles we have in our communities are more the parental male, parental female, known as father and mother. And these are our siblings who have children, and they get a lot of resources directed towards them, especially because grandmother wants to, her grandchildren to have the best. So that's usually, the parental group will have a car or a van so that they could take the baby to go visit granny, right? So a lot of resources are dedicated to the parental male and female. Now, a lot of these older cultures knew they had to make offerings to the natural world. So they created these deities or spirit roles, the ultra male and ultra female, and they would represent, the most beautiful woman with the most strong man. And they would be invited to ceremonies to dance or sing. And it was a way to call nature to bring rain, right? Or to help the bison procreate so there would be more food to eat, right? So these were constructed roles that are ultra male and ultra female, and they were used mostly in ceremony. But what's happened post-colonization is this, right? That the binary gender identities and the idea of being straight are the common social norms in Indigenous communities today because of this over 200 years of colonization and the erasure of our history and our traditions and our understanding of the complexity of the human experience. So what's happened in our communities, if you're a male, you're expected to be an ultra male, which was not really a role in traditional communities, but you were seen as being straight, a warrior, and from the biblical sense, you represented Adam. Your role was to procreate. The ultra female, again, heterosexual, a goddess or a model, and from the Bible, Eve, right? The other roles, again, are hidden, they're erased, there's no names, for these roles. And that's why a lot of two-spirit people are not out, right? Because it's not safe to be out, because people have forgotten their history and their teachings. And the problem is that these other ones are all trying to fit into these two roles that are left, and it's not possible. Right. And that's why I think we have suicides in our communities, is that you do have youth who are coming out as gay or trans, and there's no place for them. And then they try and fit into these roles and they can't. And so they ultimately give up and commit suicide. So I'm going to stop there, just something to think about. And so the work of this workshop is really filling into this gray area here, this unknown area that they tried to erase, because there is a lot of knowledge still that exists about the history of Two-Spirit people. So it's 5:02. We'll take a 10-minute break and then we'll come back and finish up. How's that, Amanda?
That's really good. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm going to. Is there a way for you to see the people who are in?
I'll stop sharing.
I have dual monitors, so I'm able to see your presentation on one and the attendees in the chat on the other. But
Oh, there's lots of comments, questions. There's 25.
yeah, people are sharing where they're from, and there's a few people that had to leave a bit early, but
yeah, Amanda, if you want to keep track of some of the questions, that'd be great.
Yeah.
So we're having a short break. Make some toast.
That's what I went and had. I had a late lunch.
I know.
One Zoom onto this Zoom, so. Yeah.
I know, I did one earlier too. It was an hour and a half.
Yeah. Yeah, this is awesome, Albert. It's the first time I'm hearing your presentation too, so. Is this the first time, just to throw that question out to everybody, is this the first time you're hearing such a presentation? Maybe they're all stepped away. Yeah, not a good time. Yeah. Are you right?
Yeah, it's going well. I'm gonna see if we can do side-by-side screen sharing. And then maybe you can see the presentation on one side and Albert on the other side.
That'd be great, yeah.
Did you want to try putting your screen up again?
Sure.
I just switched it.
Yeah, I don't have that skill yet of doing a side screen.
Oh, there we go.
Oh, there's me.
Does it work for you?
No, I just minimized it anyway.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
as if I haven't seen them before.
I can see your face on the right, and
yeah, that's fine. Yeah, I just see the PowerPoint page. That's okay. Yeah, it was just it's hard to gauge people's reaction if you don't see them.
Yeah.
I think
I don't mind answering questions while you talk too.
Yeah.
Albert, if you go to your top right of your screen, do you get, and you put your mouse over it in the corner there, does it say view?
No.
No way.
It just has the option of opening this participants screens. Doesn't show view. Like I could see, I could do mine, I can do everybody, show thumbnail video. I'm not sure what that is. I don't want to touch anything.
What if you go to the top where it says view?
Oh, I see. Yeah, I see. Something came down. Oh,
Yeah, you
come
should
down
be able
again.
to click.
I have to run, but I just wanted to say thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and giving us your time today. Really appreciate it.
Oh, great. Thanks.
Well, thanks for joining.
Yeah, I don't see view on this one. I just see hi names, panel, remote control.
I think it's different if you're the one doing the presentation.
Yeah.
But for the recording screen, I'm going to have, like on the side will be the presentation, and then there's a little thing with the participants here. So try it this way. I'm gonna run and grab a water.
So those having to leave, this presentation is being recorded and it will be posted on our website at www.anishcorp.ca. So there'll be a landing page for these series, Reclaiming Cultural Connections, Reigniting Blood Memory series. So this will be in that landing page.
And also feel free to type in some questions as we go. And then at the end, we'll make our way through the questions. Sometimes you think of a question in the moment and then you just need to type it out or else it disappears. So at least that's how I am. But I'm going to go grab a water.
Time sure goes by quickly though, hey? Like,
Yeah.
that was an hour. Wow. I didn't even feel like an hour. But yeah.
Oh, we got 5 more minutes. That seems like a long time. It's good though to have a break because it can be draining to be on Facebook or Zoom.
Yeah. Or just to get a stretch, like,
Yeah.
yeah, when you're doing Zooms, it's important to get up and move and yeah.
Oh, what's her name? Lady Gaga did a good rendition of.
I was watching that earlier.
Yeah, she was
did.
just spot on.
Really, I hope they show it again.
Well, part of it is they usually take a riff on it, right? They sort of try to embellish it, and it just goes sideways. She
Yeah.
just stayed on point and didn't do that.
What did she say? Oh, she sang the anthem.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I'm sure
And
it'll be online, eh?
yeah, probably if it's not already on YouTube. Jennifer Lopez sang that one song, From
Yeah.
Sea to Shining Sea. That one.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know which American song that is, but she did a good
Didn't
job.
find it was as dynamic as Lady Gaga. So
Mhm.
I loved Lady Gaga.
Yeah.
I didn't realize how good of a singer she was until that movie. The big movie there that she was in.
What was his name? What was the last? No,
Star is Born.
Star
A
is Born.
Star is Born. Yes,
Yeah.
that one. Like I thought, oh my gosh, I love her singing. Yeah, I like her voice. I never really listened to her before.
Yeah, Barbara Streisand did that movie with Chris Christopherson.
That's right. Yeah.
And there's 2 other versions of it. One with Judy Garland, made her
Oh,
a star. Yeah.
I like their version with Gaga, Lady Gaga.
I haven't watched it yet. I'm saving it for when I do laundry.
When's the last time you did laundry, Albert?
In March. I just been buying new clothes instead of washing.
You'd like it though. I like it. Yeah, I think it was made me
Well, I
cry.
remember the one with Barbara and Chris. That's kind of the one that's imprinted on my brain. So,
I've Yeah, I don't know if I've watched that one, but I know of it. I
well,
should
Chris was an actor in his day. He made a few movies. So,
That's right.
yeah. Okay, 1 minute, and we'll start again.
Okay. Right. This one off.
I chose this opportunity to wear some lipstick today. I never wear lipstick because it just rubs off on my mask, but my cousin got me lipstick from Cheekbone Beauty, and I got the Autumn Peltier one, which I love.
It totally looks good on you too.
Yeah, it's nice to get dressed up for something.
Yeah. Yeah, you don't get to do that often anymore.
Mm.
Okay, I guess I'll start now. We're on shared screen. So we just finished the section around the visual of what sort of pre-contact Indigenous families, communities would have looked like as being inclusive. And we see that just around, if people were, farming cultures or hunting, gathering, fishing cultures, you would need everybody to help, right? So in modern society, when someone comes out as gay or lesbian or trans, people do reject them from the family because, they don't need them to pay bills, right? So it's a very different environment where in the past, people all had a purpose and a role, and it was usually about land-based survival, and you didn't discriminate, right? That everybody had a place in the community. So just moving forward, try to wake this thing up. Sometimes it goes to sleep. Yeah, so some of the, this was by Dr. Maria Yellow Horse Braveheart. And identified some of the behaviors in terms of historical trauma that people might be expressing that are sort of not understood well in our society. Things like survivor guilt, depression, PTSD symptoms, psychic numbing, fixation to trauma, physical symptoms, low self-esteem, victim identity, anger, self-destructive behavior, including substance abuse. As I mentioned earlier, suicidal ideation, vigilance, intense fear, disassociation, compensatory fantasies, and then poor affect or emotional tolerance. And again, because we haven't had the opportunity to really unpack this history of colonization and trauma for our communities, that people don't know who to talk to, what to talk about, and just a lot of times pretending everything is normal, right? And then people might, the spirit, the mental part of a person might act out for relief, and then could be this expression of this historic trauma. For 2Spirit as well, because again, we're vulnerable, a lot of times we are not seen as sort of valid genders or valid sexual orientations. We are sort of ostracized or seen as less than, that this trauma gets projected onto us. And it's not our trauma to deal with. So the effect of this projecting trauma onto 2Spirit people is that it kills the family-centered love and nurturing, right? Where, you know, parents can reject a child if they come out as trans or they come out as gay or lesbian. So that natural flow of love and nurturing is interrupted or stops altogether. And then just common everyday homophobia and transphobia attitudes, exclusion, rejection, and shunning. And you might see that in the powwow circle. There's been some resistance to having trans female dancers in the different categories participate in powwows. Sometimes it's really subtle discrimination, or sometimes it can be overt discrimination. And then incest and sexual assault, again, Two-Spirit people being targeted because they're perceived as being vulnerable for incest and sexual assault. And really that dynamic is about power, right? Power over someone else. Humiliation, shaming, and bullying, isolation and depression. And again, murdered and being disappeared. And we know that with the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls, they expanded their mandate and their mission to include Two-Spirit LGBTQIA people in their final report and in their calls for justice. Suicidal ideation and then suicide, homelessness and poverty, then devaluing queer gender and sexual identity, and especially in a society where a lot of your worth is invested into creating grandchildren, right? And that's how you establish your social place in the family, in the community, is by having children and grandchildren. And then intimidation and threats. So, so for Two-Spirit people, that historic trauma, we've all experienced it, and that, you know, it's not ours to hold other people's trauma or to experience discrimination because of other people holding their own trauma and projecting it onto us. Other demonstrations of violence or discrimination is actually lateral violence, which could be teasing or joking. Gaslighting, which means like not answering phone calls, not answering emails, not answering people's letter. So you essentially just pretend they no longer exist. Ghosting, same thing. Microaggressions, another level of teasing. Again, cyberbullying, incest, sexual exploitation, and then domestic violence. Now, the resurgence part I'm going to talk about is, you know, because of colonization and the school systems, it was very difficult for Two-Spirit people to identify themselves or to come out or be accepted. And it wasn't until 1975 that the first Two-Spirit organization opened in San Francisco by Randy Burns and Deborah Kamen. And it was because in the US, a lot of the First Nations were moved to urban centers. They were dislocated or off their traditional territory into the cities. And they began to, you know, be a part of the gay community. And in this case, it wasn't until 1975 that the Gay American Indians was founded. So that's 45 years ago, actually. This group, in 1989, the Two-Spirit people of the First Nations in Toronto, similarly for Indigenous people who are Two-Spirit, needing supports, cultural safety, sort of common traditions, common beliefs. So they are still active today, very active in Toronto, and provide, Toronto has a large Indigenous population, so they have a large services and programs to the Two-Spirit community. And just not the Two-Spirit community, I think when you look at gender oppression or domestic violence, you know, heterosexual people can also access these resources as allies, because things don't happen, you know, in silos, you know, and that a lot of times when we have our events, Like, you know, people will bring their cousins, and then they'll bring the baby, and then they'll bring granny. And for the Two-Spirit community, that's how we function, is that we bring everybody. And it's just not exclusive to Two-Spirit people. We bring the whole community. Whereas in the gay culture, it's more, you know, people of the same age, people of the same class, people of the same ethnic identity kind of gather. And you usually do not see family represented or elders. And then as part of decolonization, and you know that the Canada, Prime Minister Harper apologized in the settlement to Indian residential school survivors, apologized for that abuse. In 2017, Prime Minister Trudeau apologized to LGBT Canadians for this history of oppression and included Indigenous people from the early days of colonization. And this is from the actual speech he made for suppressing Two-Spirit Indigenous values and beliefs. We are sorry. And actually, in the sort of 400-year history of Canada, this is actually the first time that the federal government acknowledged that they were Indigenous people who were LGBTQ. As I mentioned, the inquiry. Out of the 231 calls for justice, there are 32 that are specific to Two-Spirit LGBTQIA people. And I said it is an example of decolonization, but also the deconstruction of that binary gender that was imposed through the residential school era, in that the inquiry got its mandate from Parliament. And initially in the title, it says Indigenous Women and Girls. Now, in some people's mind, that would logically refer to biologically, right? But in the case of the commissioners that were involved in this inquiry, as well as the other people involved, the lawyers, the elders, they broadened that definition to include Two-Spirit, trans women, or gay men and lesbian women, right? So it really is a representation of decolonization and reclaiming, as I mentioned earlier, this idea of inclusion of all people that were born into this world. Two-Spirit people have also been on our own reconciliation journey, beginning back in 1988 in Minneapolis. And it's called, it's kind of like the Two-Spirit Amazing Race, where we were curious about our counterparts in the US and other parts of Canada. So what we did is we would host this gathering for 4 days. It would be alcohol and drug free. And we would venture out and find these places. You know, sometimes it was an old Bible camp. Sometimes, you know, it was up in the mountains or in the desert. And sometimes it was very rustic. I remember at Fort Capel, we all had to camp outside. And so it's been quite an adventure. It's now 33 years. This year's was canceled. Last year's was canceled due to COVID. But it's been our journey of decolonization and reconciliation, is that border, we broke through that border between Canada and the US. And we met people from other tribes, and we learned about their language, their traditions, their ceremonies, their teachings, right? Some of our activities at our gatherings is traditional foods, camping and sports. We have our own sweat lodge ceremonies, our Two-Spirit powwow, our sharing and healing circles. We've had weddings. We do social networking. We have health and skills workshops. We have Two-Spirit entertainment, which means a drag show or a poetry reading. We have access to elders, traditional crafts, cultural teachings. Two-Spirit rites of passage, and then we explore cultural sites. So Manitoba has hosted this gathering 4 times, one in 1990, 1998, 2010, and 2018. And the site that we were exploring is the petroforms at Bannock Point. We've also developed resources. We involved in research, writing articles and books about the Two-Spirit experience in Canada and the US and other parts of the world like New Zealand, Australia, and in Norway among the Sami and Hawaii. And this is a poster we developed about 6 years ago, 7 years ago. It really is meant to reach out to Two-Spirit youth who may be struggling in their family or their community. They may feel isolated. So we hired these 3 models from Winnipeg who lent us their image to show other youth that it's okay to be their authentic self. You know, there is a future. You can go to school, you can go to university, you can have a career. And so that's, and then at the bottom, we have all these phone lines that people can access. This is a photograph of the Montana Two-Spirit Gathering. And here you can see how far we've come in our journey of family and community. And this is a group of vibrant, educated, talented people. And you see the age group, there's children at the bottom and there's elders there. And it's really, you know, a great contribution to the Indigenous community as a whole, that we have our particular worldview and gifts to bring to, you know, our Indigenous experience today in the 21st century. I attended the Gay New York Pride March last in June. Actually, I can't believe it's that long ago. It was hot. It was 42 blocks long. I only made it 20 blocks, but the New Yorkers finished. And this is the New York part of the marches there. The elder in the middle, she's actually a Beverly Little Center. She's 73, and she finished that march on her own legs. But us Canadians, I guess we don't walk as much. Now, in 2018, and this has been a long-standing request with our Indigenous representative organizations like the Assembly of First Nations, Métis National Council, you know, Native Women's Association of Canada, that we wanted equal representation and equal voice in these national political bodies. And in 2018, at the AFN Assembly in Vancouver, a chief who came out as gay from St. Mary's First Nations in New Brunswick put a resolution on the floor that the AFN support the development of a national Two-Spirit organization. And that resolution passed on the floor with no, you know, it passed unanimously. And so the AFN supported, you know, the funding for this organization, and it was funded in 2019 and is active today. It's called the Two Spirits in Motion Society. So it is a national network, a national organization like the other ones, like AFN and NWAC and Métis National Council. As well, the Métis have also done some work in terms of including Two-Spirit people in their politics and their identity. In 2020, I think, or 2019, the Manitoba Métis Foundation launched or announced its Two-Spirit Michif Local. And so these are local Métis people in Manitoba, and it's the first one of its kind in Canada. They have a website and also a Facebook group. University of Winnipeg also did some work with, because with the TRC, there wasn't any specific calls to action with regard to Two-Spirit people. We did a follow-up sort of consultation of Two-Spirit and queer trans people of color. And through this 3-day seminar or meeting, we added 39 calls to action to the TRC process. We're getting towards the end of the session. So just some sort of guidelines. Adapt to the Two-Spirit reality of your child. And that's what I've learned is really the challenge in me working with some families. And I'll give you an example. I was approached in this youth project and said, you know, this family is having problems with their son. He's 6'2", he's 14, and he wears eyeliner, and he's fighting with his younger siblings, and his older brother doesn't like him because he's acting feminine. So, I met with him, and his mother, and we talked it through. And at the end, I told, the mother, I said, there's nothing wrong with your child. Your child is completely normal. And your child is doing what a two-spirit youth at that age would do, right? Experiment with gender, experiment with femininity, express their femininity. I said, the challenge for you is to adapt to your child's reality. It's you who has to change, not your child. It's to accept that you have a two-spirit child, right? And you will learn what that means, right? I don't think, everything has a reason. Everything has a positive part to it, right? And so, after a while, I heard back about that family, and that boy was doing good. He was working, and the family had changed their relationship with him and realized, right, that the problem was their reaction to him. And there wasn't a problem with him, it was their reaction. And so things can turn around if you adapt to that reality. Continue the love and nurturing of your child. As a parent or a grandparent or as a community, there is an obligation, a traditional obligation. I remember an elder years ago, her son died of AIDS, and she always spoke. She said, we're the ones that brought this child into the world. We're responsible to look after them no matter what, right? Even when they're 40 and 50, they're still your child, right? To continue that love and the nurturing. Support two-spirit gatherings. It is a place where youth can learn about their identity in a safe place with other two-spirit people. And then support chosen or surrogate families. So in many cases, the family may break down, maybe not because of someone's sexual orientation or gender identity. It could be other issues. There's a lot of other issues in families, but for some two-spirit people, they may have, if their birth family is not supportive, they may have a chosen family or a surrogate family that provides that love and nurturing. And it really is to respect that choice of that two-spirit person or youth. Create and support rites of passage. I know there's a lot of pressure today on how we've sort of structured our traditional resurgence and ceremonies around mimicking that binary gender imposed by Christianity. That there's an ideal Indigenous male and an ideal Indigenous female, and that all Indigenous females have to wear skirts to be considered sacred, and all of those kind of things that really are mimicking the past colonization. And that, for two-spirit people, you may have a lesbian woman that doesn't wear skirts or dresses and never has. And, to ask someone to put on a piece of clothing that they're not comfortable with is not tradition or culture, right? Then affirm personal gender identity, expression, and pronouns. And I've added pronouns to this because, as I said earlier, in the Cree and Ojibwe language and other languages, they didn't use he and she pronouns, but today we do, right? So part of the affirmation for people's two spirits, gender or expression or sexual orientation is to affirm it, right? And especially in a way, and now, my cousin has, a trans grandson, and that is the process, right? Where maybe in the past you used feminine pronouns, you have to shift gears and remember to use the masculine pronouns. Include two-spirit people in cultural, spiritual, and political events. And then provide two-spirit specific sexual health information. And again, that's another area, even today in health, in First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities, a lot of health educators or public health people are not comfortable in sharing information about LGBTQ sexual health. And so this vital information is lost. And then we see the results that some people might have HIV, they might have Hep C, or they might have sexually transmitted infection because they never got the information when they were younger. We're a new generation now of 2Spirit youth who are sort of evolving their own gender identity. And this is Joshua Whitehead, who's, I'm not sure where he's from, originally Manitoba might be. And again, so as I said, you know, when youth are able to graduate, junior high, high school, those are rites of passage, right? And the purpose of going to school is to graduate. And for teachers who may struggle with these issues of homophobia, transphobia, or bullying, their job is to minimize that so the student can graduate with a diploma. That's why we have schools and universities, right? It's not a social experiment. And the educators and the admin are responsible for making that a safe place. So Josh was a writer, a published writer, and there's our two of the publications that Joshua has, Full Metal Indigiqueer, and then Apple Johnny Seed, right? And his books have won awards. And again, that could be for 2Spirit youth, a career path, right? Is to become a writer. And, just those kind of things that we need to think about. And then this generation has introduced, as opposed to 2Spirit term or word or name, the idea of indigiqueer, right? So for this generation, that's what term they feel comfortable with. And more recently, we've seen some shift at sort of the First Nations governance level. And this was recent, with the date in September. Last year, the Treaty 3 area, they added a 2Spirit council to their traditional government. So you can see how these old traditions are resurging, right, in the 21st century, where we've come out of this period of colonization and starting to create space, create representation of 2Spirit people. And again, it is about nurturing and love. And that we have to be aware, a lot of stereotypes or myths or ideas about being gay and lesbian in the 21st century is that you're an adult, you're part of the gay scene, or, you have a partner and you have a same-sex marriage. All of that kind of thing is kind of based on, media or our ideas. But we have to realize that we have to think about it through the whole cycle of life, right? That this idea of being 2Spirit or LGBTQ is a constant in every family, every community. And we have to think about it in pregnancy, right? And today we have gender reveal parties, right? You have the pink box and the blue box, and one explodes, and then if you have a boy or a girl. And then the family assumes that that baby is going to be heterosexual, right? And be cisgender, which means their gender identity will align with their biological identity. Now, that is not written anywhere, right? It's an assumption. And that's where this genderization begins. At the very time of pregnancy, the couple say, well, what are you going to name if it's a boy, right? What are you going to name if it's a girl, right? What if it's a trans female? What if it's a trans male? Right? What if it's a lesbian woman? We never think about those things. We assume that the child we're given is going to be heterosexual, and that is not written anywhere. And then in infancy, and even in the early years, like the toddler, early childhood, as I mentioned, I was 7 years old, and I was expressing my, fascination with the feminine world. So that expression could come very early, and parents need to know how to address that, right? And not to suppress it. I remember my great nephew when he was He was 4 years old. One day he picked up this doll and he wouldn't let go, right? And he was in his plaid jacket and his cap, and his big boots, walking around carrying this doll. And he carried it around for about 2 weeks. And no one said anything, right? No one, teased him or mentioned it. And, for kids, it's natural to do things like this, right? And so we have to realize for Two-Spirit people, they are evolving through these early years as well into puberty and then older adolescence. And we know how tense that can be in our society to fit into your peer group and, to go through these regular rites of passage, like going to the high school prom or going to a dance and all those kind of things where children are sort of forced to try and be, male or female and all those kind of things. So just be conscious of that. And again, for children, especially trans children who want to go to school and wear the clothing that they feel is appropriate to their gender. So a little boy may want to wear a red dress to school. And so the family, the parents, and the school have to address that in a constructive way and not minimize or affect that child's self-esteem, right? And then moving into adulthood, we have same-sex marriage in Canada. So there's more people who are actually getting married. I've had friends who've been together for 40 years who are, gay and lesbian couples. So I think for gay marriages might last longer than straight ones. And then into the middle age and seniors years is that, a lot of times when people retire, they end up in personal care homes. A lot of times they're faced with going back into the closet again because these homes are really constructed on a heterosexual model, right? And that people may be homophobic and transphobic who live in those homes and would act out if someone expressed that they were gay or transgender in his home. So again, there's a lot of work to be done in that area. And these are actually two elders. That's Barbara Bruce, who's a Métis elder. She got the Order of Manitoba. She's a very accomplished businesswoman. And that's Manny Chakabi on the right there. She's a lesbian elder, Two-Spirit elder from Thunder Bay. And she's Ojibwe. And she actually had a book written. And before COVID, she was touring her book around Canada. And this is, I think, towards the end now. So part of what we've been doing is to preserve that history, right? So it's not lost. And so we've established some Two-Spirit archives, and it could be books, photographs, posters, anything that related to our history of in the movement of the gay liberation movement. So there is one at the University of Winnipeg, and it's accessible online. You're able to look at my donations of my collection. It's called the Albert McLeod Fonds, and they've all been digitized. And then the Connie Moracity Fonds. And Connie is a colleague of mine from Opaskwarak Cree Nation in Nepal. The other one is at the University of Minnesota. And yeah, and you can also check that online there as well. Another good resource is the Trevor Project, because for youth coming out, some of their experiences can be anxiety, depression, eating disorders, suicide or suicidal ideation, substance abuse, challenges in school, and just the whole process of coming out. And then a glossary of words that parents or family members need to know, because language changes a lot, and there's like non-binary is a new term that's being used. As I mentioned, genderqueer. So there's a lot of new terminology that people need to be aware of. There are 1-800 numbers that people can call. There's the Winnipeg Rainbow Resource Center in Osborne Village. And as I mentioned, the Two-Spirit people of the First Nations in Toronto has a lot of online resources you can access as well. Some of the policy implications, Indigenous gender, diverse gender and sexual identity norms, they predate colonization. So this is not something new, right, as a society. Expect more Two-Spirit and trans-masculine and feminine and non-binary students at the elementary, middle, high school, and university levels. Federal and provincial legislation trumps policy. And that means that in Canada, we have laws that prohibit discrimination against homophobic discrimination, sexual orientation discrimination in the workplace or in society generally, as well as legislation that prohibits discrimination based on gender identity or gender expression. And this also applies to First Nations on reserve communities as well, that you cannot discriminate on those areas. In developing programs, consult, inform, and include Two-Spirit youth, parents, and community organizations in the process of developing programs or resources. Practice, and this could be everyday practice. Intervene when you witness offensive behavior or language. Use inclusive language to ensure everyone feels welcome and respected. And sometimes you'll hear it at bingo or at powwows, they'll say, ladies and gentlemen, and that's really changed to say, hi folks, good evening everyone, a more inclusive way of welcoming people. Then challenge policies, practices, and procedures that create barriers for Two-Spirit people. And then apologize regardless of intent. Everyone makes mistakes in an ally role. What matters is how you respond when it gets brought to your attention. And then be courageous. Don't be afraid to learn, ask for more information, and then provide support. Just in my closing slide, and Roger shared this with me, and it really talks about this Indigenous worldview and reflection on colonization. He said, the strength of a culture is not defined by what it can repel, but by what it can absorb. And this really says that, for Indigenous people who've had tens of thousands of years of survival in this part of the world, we have a lot to build on. We have a lot of knowledge, a lot of tools. And even with colonization, 500 years compared to 10,000 years to 20,000 years is just a blip, right? And we're coming out of that. We're absorbing that 500 years and we're moving forward, right? With all of these tools that our ancestors have given us. So that's the end of my presentation. We can go into any questions. Oh, why do I still have it up? Oh, that's my own screen. Aja. Here we are. Who survived? We got 14. We gained 3.
Yeah, there's a few who joined and a few who had to leave early. So
yeah, it's a bit long. So
it's very informative. I really enjoyed all of it. Just going through the comments here. There's not really any questions. I guess I'll just put it out there. If anybody has a question and they'd like to speak it, there's a little hand button, or you can go ahead and unmute yourself and share your question. There's not too many of us, so I think that's fine. But maybe I'll start with a question while
sure.
I do. So I was wondering, you had mentioned that there's quite a few different programs available, but I was wondering if you knew of any kind of Inuit specific programs that function specifically for isolated communities. I guess it would be the same for First Nation isolated communities as well.
Yeah, and we work with the Fiatcha Canada Pride, which is the organization's, it's an organization that supports Pride events across Canada. And increasingly there are Pride events on reserve in Canada. And sometimes they're spontaneous, people will, have the idea, and they'll get everybody to decorate their trucks, and they'll get some pride flags, and they'll drive around the community, right? And that's a pride event. That's fine. Like Cross Lake First Nations or Pimichimac here in northern Manitoba, I think it's their second pride they've had, or third pride. So that's an on-reserve one, and that is through the support of the Chief and Council. And it's a big event, right? They have the parade, and then they have an event in the town hall, or town hall, and they have speakers. So it's quite a celebration. I think in the Inuit communities, it would be relying more on the LGBT groups or supports. Like, sometimes we think a group has to be big, it could be 3 people, right? And with internet, there's a lot of planning that can happen. And I know in the north, there are places where people will put the pride flag up as sort of an expression of support, right? Some of the work we've done with Inuit people is there's been some resistance or reluctance to talk about Inuit people or LGBTQ. And again, it is a smaller population. They, in many cases, people do know each other. And so this idea of coming out as gay, lesbian, or trans, and again, these are labels that are not traditionally in the Inuit history or language. But we know that, in the past, before contact, there were LGBTQ Inuit. Like, I don't think there's any place in the world that there wasn't gay people. Right? It would be pretty unique if there was. So yeah, I think there is some tensions there in trying to reach out to the Inuit leadership around that representation.
Mhm.
Albert, I just have a question. I know you had corrected me at one point too, like we have workshops as a part of our Culture Connections Reignite Blood Memory. And some of those are, ribbon skirts and ribbon shirts.
Yeah.
And how can we be more supportive to the 2Spirit community where we can have workshops for them too, to come and make traditional wear that they feel comfortable in when attending ceremonies.
Yeah, and I've seen different versions of 2Spirit regalia, like sometimes, and I think with Dr. James McCocus and his partner Anthony, they actually won Amazing Race Canada. And I think it was last year or the year before. And in one of the episodes, they wore these mini ribbon skirts. Did you see that?
No.
They were really cute. But it was a reference to Murdered and Missing, right? And so because they had to run, they had to make them short.
Right.
So that's a visual, and that's what I mean. It is about diversity of expression. And I've seen, a colleague of mine get married to a woman, and he made this long ribbon shirt that actually went to his ankles. It was like, open on the side. And he's an artist, right? He runs a museum, art museum, and is it Regina? And that's what I mean. I think we really stuck in this rut of what is appropriate, right? And we really focused on the ribbon skirt and the shirt as expressions of our identity, and not experimented with different designs or different design elements, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, Indigenous women used to wear leggings, and men, right? They used leggings in order to go through the bush, right? They were practical, right? Like, you used your common sense, right?
Yeah.
And so that's what I mean. I think we need to step away from this sort of narrow definition of how we express culture, because it becomes static, right? And then we get in a rut. And that's why we have the Wendigos, right? And that's why we have Nanabusho and Wisagajak, is to keep us from getting in a rut, because if we get in a rut, we become vulnerable, right? And that we're not open to change. And, to me, like, in ceremonies, what does it mean if like a biological woman shows up and doesn't wear a skirt to a sweat? Like, what does it mean? Like, is there going to be lightning, Um, and maybe they're meant to be there to represent diversity. Maybe it's nanabojo, maybe it's recycling in a human form to test our values, right? We don't know. But and that's what I mean. We are always tempted to rely on our human thing is to control and interfere and reject, right? It's about control and power, right? It's a piece of cloth. There's bigger things that we have to deal with than cloth or fabric.
That's interesting. I've been to a few different sweats where, those questions have come up where, there's been people who they just weren't sure if they would be welcome in a sweat if they weren't comfortable wearing the skirt, and then that sort of thing. But I think you're right. There's more important things that we can worry about, and I think ultimately ceremony is about, feeding your spirit, and you're there to, be with Creator, not worry about your attire. So I really like.
Well, I think, if you're a knowledge, if you share knowledge, if you perceive yourself to be a healer or a facilitator of ceremony, the way I understand it, you are there to help the people who want healing. A lot of what I see is the healthy people healing themselves, healing each other. You have to have a big truck to get out there. And it's almost become this sort of core group of people who are doing ceremony with each other, who have everything and who are healthy, right? How does the person who's struggling reach you if you're only focused on each other and having all these rules and how you fit in, right? The person who needs the healing is not going to reach you because you're all wrapped up in this other stuff and not being aware. I'll tell you a story. Vanessa Barrera was murdered in 2007. She was 17 years old. And they found her body up on Pipeline Road there in the bush. Her cousin arranged her funeral at the Thunderbird House. For 4 days, she had a wake there. The first day, this little man showed up at the door, and he said he would help us. He would sing drum songs, and he did. For 4 days, Vanessa's cousins and family sat at that drum, and he sang these songs for 4 days. We didn't know who he was. And he left after that, and I've never seen him since. That was 2007. And that's what we're told, That eastern doorway at the Thunderbird House that's the door of creation, right? And we needed this man, this elder, to come and sing for this young girl who had died. And he showed up out of nowhere and left, right? And that's what I mean. We are given what we need. And if we have all these rules who can come in, they're never going to get in the door because we made up all these rules.
Cool. One of the comments in the chat is from one of our knowledge keepers, Sharon. She said that she goes to the Nakumis Sundance and she sees that there's quite a few people, there's quite a few 2Spirit members who dance with pride, and it must be beautiful to kind of feel that things are becoming more open and comfortable, to the point where, you know, I've met jingle dress dancers, trans jingle dress dancers, seen powwow dancers, you know, men wearing ribbon skirts, and there's just, I think that the times are changing, and it's thanks to organizations and activists like yourself, you know, being vocal and saying things that need to be heard, and then people are listening. So, you know, I love
Well, you
that.
can thank my grandmother, who was born in 1897.
I was just feel.
That's 3 centuries our family stretches over.
I don't see any other questions. If anybody wants to ask something, you're more than welcome. But I think that's all for my
Great.
questions.
Yeah, it's been almost 2 hours.
Thank you, Albert.
Good class.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you. You know, I just wanted to add, like, some of the teachings that I've heard about 2Spirit is that, you know, you talked about roles and purposes, right? And the gifts that they bring. And long ago that they were able to play those dual roles where they could go out and be with the men and hunt, or they could stay back at the camp with the women, like, and you know, vice versa, for the genders, and they weren't viewed, you know, that was their spirit, and so, and honored them. And so yeah, that's what I've heard about 2Spirit, and you know, in our traditions. So yeah, I think that, you know, the education definitely needs to be, even in the school systems, that could reduce, you know, the suicides that we experience. I have family members that are, and you know, their need to be accepted, and to be loved for who they are. And so I just want to say thank you for coming and sharing um, your knowledge with us here today. And again, for everyone, I just want to say, if you know, if you have family members or parents or aunts or uncles or cookums or school teachers or coworkers who need to hear this presentation, that you can redirect them to our website at Anish, www.anishcorp.ca, and you'll find these presentations and all the other presentations that we do there, and they can listen to it at their time of leisure, when they can, you know, make a commitment with intent to come and learn. So Amanda will be sending out a brief survey, and I hope that you'll be able to take the time to do it and send it back to us. If you'd like to hear more of Albert, or we can have him come back again, and maybe during the evening, so that, you know, those who weren't able to partake today but have questions, that they can come back and ask those directly to Albert. So again, you know, even though we're ending, if you have questions, please forward them, and we'll forward them on to Albert, and we'll get you connected with him, or family members that might have questions for Albert. We'll certainly link you up to that. With that, I want to say hi, Albert, for coming and sharing. Amanda, thank you for moderating today's Zoom for us, and thank you to every one of you who came and spent your afternoon with us. Prayers that you stay safe and you stay healthy during this difficult time, and hopefully we can all come together soon one day, and share these stories safe, you know, face to face, and and embrace one another, which I miss hugging people, and I look forward to that day that I can hug people again. So with that, we'll say goodbye.
Bye. Bye, everybody.
This is it.